This is an early scene from GTA 5 Online on the default HDR calibration settings, and maybe you can appreciate the picture looking a bit washed out, with the highlight detail in the clouds appearing slightly blown out. To make it clearer for you to see, let me turn on the luminance heatmap system on my Canon reference monitor. The monochrome bits are in SDR or Standard Dynamic Range domain of under 200 nits, whereas the colored portions are above 200 nits, and you can see that too many elements in this particular scene exceeded 200 nits, therefore reducing the HDR impact, because when everything is bright, you don't get the contrast which allows bright specular highlights to pop. Now, this is roughly the same scene after I have adjusted the in-game HDR settings from the default values, and to my eyes, there's more pop and depth to the HDR presentation, with better retention of specular highlight detail if you pay attention to the clouds again. If we turn on the luminance heatmap on the Canon reference monitor, then you can see that the majority of the HDR image is now under 200 nits, with only selected portions exceeding 200 nits to deliver an improved HDR effect. To do the same on your television, you have to understand what each HDR calibration setting inside GTA 5 does. So let me demonstrate by using my Canon reference monitor with inbuilt HDR analysis tool. There are three HDR calibration settings, namely contrast, paper white, and peak brightness. Contrast is a bit of a misnomer, because what this setting does is to adjust the near black gamma, as you can see when I move the slider up all the way to the maximum value of 100 and then all the way down to the minimum value of 0. At 0, a lot of the shadow detail will be crushed, so I generally recommend not going below 50. Let me reset it to default. Okay, the next setting is paper white, and this affects mainly the midtones all the way up to diffuse white. The higher the paper white value, the brighter the overall APL or average picture level, and the default setting of 310 is definitely too bright, causing the HDR image to appear more washed out and lacking in depth. But before we go about adjusting it, let's explore the third setting, which is peak brightness. This is easy. It allows you to set the maximum peak brightness inside the game, affecting mainly the highlight region. Note that the paper white setting interacts with the peak brightness setting. Because the default paper white setting of 310 was so bright, it caused the actual measured peak brightness inside the game to be higher than the value set using the peak brightness slider. And therein lies a helpful clue we can use to set the paper white setting correctly inside GTA 5. We should find a value that lets the peak brightness value match up to the actual in-game peak brightness output. First, let's set peak brightness to 800, which in theory should output 800 nits, the hard clipping point of most LG OLED televisions with HGiG engaged. Next, let us slowly decrease the paper white setting using the slider. Here, the measured peak brightness was 830 nits, but that's still a bit brighter than 800 nits, so let's keep going down until we find the right spot. There, with a paper white setting of 130, we got a measured peak brightness output of 790 nits, which is close enough to 800 nits. And going back into the game, it certainly looked more pleasing to the eyes than the default paper white setting of 310, which was overly bright. As for the contrast slider, I found the default value of 80 too contrasty, especially on an OLED television with 0 candelas per square meter blacks. So I decided to nudge it up, settling on the maximum value of 100 for the most natural looking coming out of black. With a contrast value of 100 and a paper white setting of 130 in place, all that's left to do is to set peak brightness to the HGiG clipping point of your television, making sure you have engaged HGiG of course. On most LG OLED TVs, it would be 800 nits. If your television doesn't support HGiG to disable in-TV tone mapping, then I suggest just setting peak brightness to 1000 nits, which is what most TVs are optimized for, unless you own a high-nit LED LCD, in which case just go higher. Now, Some LG OLED owners may be wondering whether to use HGiG or dynamic tone mapping to get the best HDR picture from PS5 or Xbox Series X games. To help you make the right choice, I've done a video comparing HGiG versus dynamic tone mapping on an LG OLED, so go watch the video by clicking here.